Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley are among the brightest and most mischievous characters in the Harry Potter universe. Their jokes could lift spirits even in the darkest of times. But as much as we love the twins, not all of their pranks were truly harmless. Today, let us look at the situations where the Weasleys clearly crossed the line. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Montague and the Vanishing Cabinet, a joke that nearly cost a life. What Fred and George did to Montague can only be described as cruelty. Locking someone inside a vanishing cabinet was both reckless and dangerous. The poor guy spent hours helplessly drifting between Hogwarts and Knockturn Alley, completely unable to escape. He survived only thanks to a risky attempt at disapparition, something that could have ended in disaster. The strangest part? The twins later recounted this prank with a completely calm expression, as if it were nothing more than a harmless joke. Number 2, Ron and the Unbreakable Vow, playing with magic that borders on deadly. The Unbreakable Vow is one of the most powerful magical bonds. Breaking it means death. It's hard to believe that Fred and George nearly involved 5-year-old Ron in such a thing. The younger brother, unaware of the consequences, agreed to take part in the joke. Only Arthur Weasley, our timely intervention, saved the boy's life. Ron later said it was the only time he'd seen Dad as angry as Mum, and although it is doubtful the young twins were powerful enough to complete the ritual, the very intention is frightening. Number 3, testing experimental products. First years used as test subjects. After receiving Harry's Triwizard winnings, Fred and George were able to fulfill their dream and open their own shop. But the road to success was questionable. Before the shop opened, they actively tested their inventions, using first-year students as guinea pigs. Young students often ended up in the hospital wing after these tests. Hermione tried to stop this, but the twins brushed her off and continued experimenting on children with products that were far from ready. Number 4. Ron's arachnophobia. Not a joke, but a childhood trauma. Every fan knows Ron Weasley is terrified of spiders. In Chamber of Secrets, this seems like a plot detail, but the roots of his fear are much deeper and sadder. As kids, the twins decided to get revenge on Ron for breaking a broom and turned his teddy bear into a giant spider. Remember, Ron was 3 years old. For a toddler, this was a nightmare, one that developed into a lifelong phobia. Number 5. Percy and the trap inside the Egyptian pyramid. Percy Weasley was always strict, rule-following, and uptight. But that didn't give his brothers the moral right to stage a prank that could have ended in tragedy. During a family trip to Egypt, Fred and George tried to lock Percy inside a pyramid. If their plan had worked, the consequences could have been much worse than irritation or an argument. Number 6. Professor Quirrell and enchanted snowballs. This one seems harmless until you remember the details. During their first year, Fred and George enchanted snowballs to chase and hit Quirrell on the head, including the back of his turban where Voldemort was hidden. Yes, Quirrell was a villain, but at that moment no one knew it, and the twins were essentially bullying a stuttering, anxious, defenseless man who couldn't even respond properly. This joke is one of their most questionable. Number 7, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a dream come true or a source of danger. Opening their shop was a brilliant achievement, but some of their products were risky. Love potions that could make someone fall in love against their will are a prime example. Ron himself suffered after eating one of those chocolates. Other items could be dangerous too. Draco, for instance, used Peruvian instant darkness powder to help Death Eaters infiltrate Hogwarts, so the shop wasn't entirely harmless. Number 8. Extendable ears and breached privacy. Fred and George treated their prototype extendable ears like a secret weapon. They whispered over wires, adjusted charms, and bragged, "We'll hear everything from here to the attic." One evening, when Molly and Arthur called a private family meeting in the kitchen, the twins saw their chance. They slid the magical string under the door and pressed their ears close. Voices poured in, serious, hushed, and tense. Arthur said, "Voldemort is gathering support faster than we expected," and Molly whispered, "The children must not know." Fred and George exchanged a wide-eyed look. For once, a joke didn't feel like a joke anymore. But the real damage came later. Ginny noticed their pale faces and demanded to know what they had heard. The twins, still rattled, blurted out details about Voldemort, the Order of the Phoenix, and the growing danger outside the burrow. Ginny froze. Her breath trembled. "Why would Mum hide this? Are we in danger?" she asked, voice cracking. Instead of protecting her, the twins had dragged her into a fear she wasn't ready to face. When Molly discovered the truth, her fury shook the walls. Yet even without the scolding, Fred and George understood they had crossed a line. Some magic wasn't meant for mischief, especially when it broke the trust of the people they loved. Number 9. Magical fireworks and chaos in Hogwarts. Fred and George's rebellion during their 5th year had the whole castle cheering. Their enchanted fireworks exploded into roaring dragons and whistling rockets that chased Dolores Umbridge down the corridors. "Follow her!" Fred yelled, and the fiery serpent obeyed, snapping at her heels. Students doubled over with laughter. Even Professor Flitwick later said, "I could have stopped them, but I didn't really want to." It felt like justice. It felt like freedom. But chaos rarely stays harmless for long. One firework burst too close to a group of first years, showering them with sparks that left small burns along their sleeves. Another crashed into a tapestry, setting it ablaze before Filch smothered it with his coat. Bookshelves rattled, windows cracked, even Peeves ducked for cover. Dumbledore finally had to intervene, raising his wand and murmuring a spell that drew the wild creations toward him like metal to a magnet. When the smoke cleared, the laughter faded. Fred and George had made their point, but at a cost. Their brilliance shone that day, bright and spectacular, but so did their recklessness. Number 10. The fake fortune-teller prank on Neville. Fred and George, as future forecaster, looked innocent enough. A tiny brass box with a silver dial and a soft blue glow inside, as if it held a whisper of prophecy. "Just touch it and it tells your fate," Fred bragged. In reality, the device was a prank tool packed with pre-written predictions, each more dramatic than the last. Some warned of humiliations, others of disasters. The twins thought it was all in good fun. They never imagined how deeply one line of text could strike. Neville Longbottom was the first to try it seriously. He cupped the device gently, as if afraid to break it, and whispered, "Please say something good, just for once." The box hummed. The dial spun. A strip of parchment slid out. Neville read it aloud. "You will lose everything you love." His voice faltered on the last word. The colour drained from his face. "Everything," he repeated, barely breathing. Thoughts of his gran, his plants, even Trevor, rushed through his mind. The message hollowed him out in seconds. For days afterward, Neville walked through Hogwarts like a ghost. He sat through herbology without speaking. He dropped his quill 3 times in Transfiguration. Even Professor McGonagall paused during roll call and asked softly, "Mr. Longbottom, are you quite all right?" He only nodded and stared at his desk. The prank had spiraled far beyond a joke. Fred and George watched him from across the common room, their usual grins gone. George whispered, "We didn't mean to scare him like that." But it was too late. Fear had stuck to Neville like a curse, and the twins finally saw how careless magic could wound more deeply than they ever intended. Number 11. Hermione's magically dyed hair. Hermione Granger had never been afraid to confront Fred and George when their pranks went too far. One afternoon, after she caught them experimenting on first years again, she marched straight up to them and snapped, "You two are absolutely irresponsible." The twins exchanged a look. Fred muttered, "She's asking for it," and George nodded with a grin. Their revenge was quick. During potions, they slipped a few drops of enchanted dye into her cauldron, certain it would cause a harmless surprise. The moment Hermione leaned over her brew, a soft pop echoed through the dungeon. Her hair flashed bright emerald, glowing like enchanted moss. Gasps filled the room. Seamus whispered, "Blimey! She looks like she fell into a cauldron of leprechaun ink." Even Malfoy froze mid-smirk. Hermione grabbed a handful of curls, horrified. "This isn't funny," she shouted, her voice shaking. She tried reparifage, nothing. Finite incantatem, still nothing. The dye clung to every strand, shimmering mockingly. By lunchtime, the entire school was buzzing. Younger students giggled as she passed, and even some Gryffindors struggled to stay serious. But for Hermione, the laughter felt like needles. She slammed her books onto the table and hissed, "I have a presentation today. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" It was rare for her to lose her composure, but this time her cheeks were hot with anger and embarrassment. She refused to look anyone in the eye. Ron Weasley, usually the first to laugh at anything involving magical mishaps, didn't find it amusing at all. He stood up, glared at the twins and said, "You two went too far. Apologize now." The firmness in his voice surprised everyone, even Hermione. Fred and George exchanged guilty glances. Their joke had spiraled far beyond what they intended. By the time Hermione's hair finally returned to its natural brown hours later, the twins were already rehearsing their apologies, realizing this prank had crossed a line no dye could wash away. Number 12. Lee Jordan's trapped briefcase. Fred and George always claimed that Lee Jordan was practically immune to their pranks. He knew their tricks. He knew their signals. He even knew when to duck. But the day they swapped his school bag for a magical duplicate, even Lee didn't stand a chance. The fake bag looked identical to his own, except for one feature. The moment someone unbuckled the flap, it erupted in a blast of bright green, sneezing slime. "It's harmless," George had bragged. "Just a tiny explosion." But nothing involving the twins was ever tiny. The prank went wrong the instant Professor Snape reached for the bag. He mistook the enchanted duplicate for a student as belongings and tugged it open. A violent cloud of slime exploded upward like a geyser. It covered Snape's robes, the front row of desks, and half the dungeon walls. Snape froze, his eyes narrowed. "Who," he hissed, "is responsible for this filth?" The classroom erupted into choking sneezes. Even Hermione scrambled for the door. The evacuation was so chaotic that later students swore the corridors smelled like pepper, and troll snot. Lee stood by the doorway, horrified. He hadn't even touched the bag, yet Snape's glare landed squarely on him. "Mr. Jordan," he said icily, "detention for a week. Report nightly at 7. Lee tried to explain. "Professor, it wasn't mine." But Snape raised a hand. "Enough. I will not tolerate your antics in my classroom." That final word dripped like poison. Lee had no defense. The twins watched him leave, shoulders slumped, still sneezing uncontrollably. Fred and George apologized later that evening, voices low for once. "We didn't mean for Snape to grab it," Fred muttered. Lee didn't shout. He didn't laugh. He only said, "You should thought about that before you put it in my path." It was the first time he refused to sit with them at dinner. Even the twins felt the weight of it. They had learned painfully that not every joke stayed in their small circle. Sometimes it exploded, literally, onto the wrong person. Number 13. Nose-biting teacups and their misuse. Fred and George were always tinkering with enchanted objects, but their self-writing quill was one of their strangest inventions. It looked harmless enough, just a thin, green-feathered quill humming faintly as if bursting to write. "It'll do the work for you," Fred had promised. Teachers once suspect a thing. The truth was far less impressive. The quill scribbled nonsense, misspelled words, impossible dates, and phrases like, "The moon is a large egg laid by a sky dragon." Even the twins admitted it had a personality problem. They tested it on Colin Creevey, who trusted them far more than he should have. The poor boy clutched the quill during his exam, whispering, "Are you sure this will help? Professor McGonagall said no magic tools." George only winked and said, "It's harmless assistance, mate." The moment the exam began, the quill shot across the parchment, scratching out wild, looping sentences. Colin watched in horror as it wrote things like, "Transfiguration is when a cat becomes a chair of emotional significance," which wasn't even close to the lesson. When the results came back, Colin's face went pale. A big red D stared up at him from the top of his parchment. McGonagall called him to her office, demanding, "Mr. Creevey, would you care to explain why your essay claims minotaurs founded Hogsmeade?" Colin could barely speak. "It wasn't me," he whispered. "The quill. It had a mind of its own." His voice cracked, and he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Fred and George snickered from the back of the corridor, but even Lee Jordan didn't join in this time. He crossed his arms and muttered, "Not funny, lads. He's just a kid." The twins fell silent for a moment, realizing they had gone too far. Colin avoided them for weeks afterward, still embarrassed by the memory of McGonagall sighing, closing her eyes and saying, "Magic is no substitute for effort, Mr. Creevey." The quill was thrown into the twins' junk box, never to be used again. Number 14. Turning Ginny's hamster into a light show. Ginny Weasley adored animals. Her favourite was a tiny, soft-furred hamster named Nibbles. She carried him everywhere, whispering secrets into his ear and letting him nap in her pockets. But one afternoon, Fred and George decided Nibbles needed an upgrade. With a flick of their wands, they cast a charm that made the hamster sprint across the ceiling, glow bright yellow, and squeak out something that suspiciously resembled the Goblin March. Even the twins gasped when the tune came out perfectly in rhythm. At first, everyone laughed. Even Ron muttered, "Blimey, he's singing." But the fun ended quickly. Startled by his own glowing body, Nibbles scrambled across the room, launched himself off a picture frame, and vanished straight into the fireplace. A faint pop echoed inside the chimney, and then nothing. Ginny froze. Her hands trembled. "Where are Snibbles? Bring him back!" she cried. But the hamster was gone. Ginny's heartbreak shook the whole burrow for days. She cried until her eyes were red, refusing to speak to anyone except Bill, who tried to comfort her by saying softly, "He must have found his way somewhere safe." The house felt colder without the little hamster. Tiny rustles. Fred and George avoided looking at her, too ashamed to admit they had no idea where Nibbles ended up, or whether their charm had been entirely safe. It was the first time even they didn't find their own joke funny. Molly Weasley's anger was legendary that week. She stormed through the house, shouting, "If you two don't learn to think before you cast a spell, I swear I'll send you both to stay with Aunt Muriel." Fred and George hid in the chicken coop, terrified to come out. For once, their mischief had crossed a line. Ginny never forgot the day her glowing ceiling-running Nibbles disappeared, and the twins never again dared to improve. One of her pets, number 15, Slime in the Slytherin Goblet. The Great Hall had been transformed into a shimmering spectacle of inter-house unity, its banners enchanted to glow softly in shared hues of scarlet, gold, green, blue, and yellow. For once, the atmosphere was warm and gentle, a deliberate attempt by the staff to soothe the persistent tensions between houses. Harry remembered seeing Professor McGonagall murmuring approvingly that it was a night for peace, while even Professor Snape looked marginally less severe than usual. Yet beneath that temporary harmony lurked a mischief waiting to erupt, the kind of mischief only Fred and George Weasley could engineer with such confidence and complete disregard for consequences. To them the celebration was an irresistible stage, and Slytherin's ornate silver goblet provided the perfect opportunity for what they cheerfully described as a simple mood booster. Fred had once declared that practical jokes are the heartbeat of Hogwarts, and on that evening, the twins decided to make that heartbeat thunder. They slipped through the crowd with practiced ease, blending into groups of laughing students and drifting candles. The Slytherin table was elegantly decorated, its centerpiece, the large ancestral goblet engraved with serpentine motifs that gleamed under the floating lights. It was a symbol of pride, tradition, and unquestionable Slytherin identity. The twins' eyes shone with anticipation as they charmed the contents with a spell borrowed from one of their early experiments for their skiving snack boxes, one which had produced what George once jokingly called the stickiest muck this side of Knockturn Alley. They whispered the incantation, flicked their wands with synchronized precision, and the liquid inside the goblet thickened into a slow swirling emerald slime. What made the prank seem to them particularly brilliant was the subtlety of the transformation. From the outside, the goblet appeared unchanged. The spell manipulated the surface to look as smooth and reflective as ever. Only once the cup was lifted would the spell reveal its full force. As Fred later boasted to Lee Jordan, it was a masterpiece of delayed disaster. The twins had every expectation that someone from Slytherin, ideally Draco Malfoy, would pick up the goblet and become the unfortunate victim. But fate, with its trademark irony, had other plans, ones that Fred and George had not considered in their calculations. Millicent Bulstrode, broad-shouldered, stern-faced, and already irritated by the noise of Gryffindors across the hall, chose that exact moment to reach for the goblet. Millicent was not someone anyone wished to embarrass. She was known for her quick temper and an intimidating glare that could silence first years from 3 tables away. Her fingers wrapped around the ornate handle with the confidence of a student expecting nothing more than a sip of pumpkin juice. The enchantment activated instantly. The thick green slime surged upward with explosive enthusiasm, pouring out over the rim in a sticky cascade. It slapped across Millicent's face, soaked her hair, and oozed down the front of her freshly pressed Slytherin robes like molten swamp muck. A collective gasp spread through the great hall. Even the enchanted ceiling flickered as if startled. Harry saw Hermione cover her mouth, trying to suppress a horrified sound, while Ron muttered something that might have been admiration mixed with panic. For a moment, Millicent froze, slime dripping from her chin, her eyes wide with disbelief. The Slytherin table erupted, not in laughter, but in outrage. Blaise Zabini leapt to his feet, shouting indignantly, while Pansy Parkinson brandished her napkin like a weapon. The slime continued to flow, as though the cup itself were delighted with its performance, splattering the table and pooling onto the stone floor. The chaos was immediate and absolute. Students stumbled back from the Slytherin table as Millicent flung her arms, trying to wipe the slime from her eyes. With each movement, the enchanted substance clung more stubbornly, stretching in long, sticky strands. Someone from Hufflepuff cried out in astonishment as a glob of slime launched into the air and landed with a slap on their sleeve. A Ravenclaw prefect shouted for order, only to slide on the rapidly spreading puddle and collide with a group of terrified first years. The prank, designed for a single moment of shock, had become a chain reaction of pandemonium. Fred and George, witnessing the spectacle from their seats, looked both thrilled and horrified. Fred whispered something under his breath that Harry suspected was not celebratory. The twins had not accounted for the enchanted slime's enthusiastic expansion. George once described the substance as temperamental, a quality one should never ignore in magical chemistry. The great hall, previously filled with the soft glow of unity, now echoed with shrieks, protests, and the unmistakable squelch of magical viscosity meeting medieval stone. Professor Snape's reaction was perhaps the most legendary aspect of the entire debacle. His robes billowed as he approached the Slytherin table, his expression thunderous. Harry would later recall that Snape looked more furious than when Neville melted a cauldron and nearly set his desk on fire. Snape reached Millicent with swift precision, flicked his wand, and muttered a counter-curse that caused the slime to retreat in reluctant tendrils before evaporating with a hiss. Millicent stood trembling, her robe stained and her dignity shattered. Her eyes burned with rage, and for a moment it appeared she might charge across the room in search of the culprits. Snape, however, had already located them. His gaze sliced through the hall like a curse. Fred and George stiffened, both pale beneath their freckles. Snape's voice, cool and venomous, echoed across the hall as he declared, "This is no mere prank. It is sabotage of a school celebration." He added that he had never in all his years witnessed such disrespect for inter-house unity. Harry distinctly remembered a group of Gryffindors shrinking under Snape, as glare despite having had no part in the prank. The professor, fury felt almost tangible, a storm gathering in the torch's glow. Number 16, fake fan letters to Harry, Fred and George Weasley had always treated mischief as an art form, and for years their pranks were viewed as part of the natural rhythm of life at Hogwarts. Yet during the months that followed the Triwizard Tournament, the atmosphere around Harry Potter changed so drastically that even the smallest joke could turn into a spark in a volatile room. The school whispered about him constantly, students stared, speculated, and pointed, and his name echoed through corridors with a mixture of admiration and fear. It was precisely in this tense climate that the twins chose to execute one of their more elaborate and ill-timed schemes. Their idea was simple. If the world already believed Harry was a celebrity, why not make him believe it too? What began as a mischievous thought spiraled into a situation that would leave Harry feeling far more exposed than he had ever been on the Quidditch pitch. The prank took shape in the form of letters, delicate parchment, scented edges, and a handwriting unlike anything Harry had seen at the school. The first note arrived early in February, folded like a valentine and sealed with a shimmering charm clearly meant to mimic glittering rose wax. It carried a perfume so floral that Ron suspected someone had attempted to drown an entire bouquet inside a cauldron. The letter was signed, "Only your secret admirer," and for a brief moment Harry felt a warm but confusing flutter in his stomach. The words praised his courage during the tournament and described him as the youngest champion with the bravest heart, a phrase that, in hindsight, had the cadence of Fred and George to it as humour. At the time, however, Harry had no reason to suspect deception. The second letter arrived 2 days later, this time containing a small photograph. It depicted a blurry silhouette of a girl with long curls, waving shyly before hiding her face behind her hand. The image seemed deliberately vague, as though created to spark Harry's imagination rather than identify the sender. The photos smelled faintly of vanilla and broom wax, an odd combination that Hermione later suspected was the result of spilled cleaning potions in the twins' room. This letter was even more flattering, filled with sentimental lines such as, "Every time you walk into the Great Hall, my heart leaps like a startled owl." Harry felt embarrassed reading it, but part of him wondered whether someone at Hogwarts had truly developed an affection for him beyond the swirl of rumours. What Harry did not know was that Fred and George had gone to great lengths to perfect the hoax. They tested various perfumes on Percy, sold parchment, experimenting until they found the one scent that lingered longest in a dormitory. They borrowed a camera from Colin Creevey under the pretext of testing new, photo-compatible fireworks. They even practiced altering handwriting using a quill enchanted to imitate elegant, looping script. To them the prank was harmless, a humorous distraction from Umbridge's tyranny and the darkening climate of the wizarding world. But to Harry, who had barely recovered from the trauma of seeing Cedric's lifeless body and hearing Voldemort's rebirth, the letters became a peculiar emotional burden he had not expected. The true turning point came with the third letter. This one was more intimate, describing moments Harry supposedly hadn't noticed, like the way he brushed snow from his hair outside the owlery, or how he paused at the stairs as though listening to something only the bravest souls can hear. The descriptions unsettled Harry. He started wondering if someone was following him around the castle, watching him closely enough to record such details. His sleep was restless that night, and he spent hours replaying every corridor he walked through, every face he saw, wondering who among them might be the writer. He was already living under the pressure of the ministry, his denial, and the whispers labeling him unstable. The last thing he needed was a mysterious observer shadowing his steps. The situation escalated when Seamus Finnegan found the fourth letter on Harry's bedside table and carried it, with the earnest enthusiasm of someone delivering vital mail, to the Gryffindor common room. The parchment unfolded itself mid-air, spilling its perfume like a spell gone rogue. A cluster of first years leaned in, giggling and whispering. A group of older girls wondered aloud whether Harry had finally gotten a girlfriend. And before Harry could stop it, the letter had begun to read itself aloud with a soft, enchanted voice that recited lines such as, "Your eyes shine brighter than any wand light I have ever known." The room erupted into laughter, cheers, and playful teasing. Harry felt heat rise to his face so intensely he thought he might burst into flames. It was in that moment that Fred and George realized the joke had grown far beyond their original intention. They watched from the staircase as Harry tried to snatch the letter from a group of second years who were now debating whether the mysterious admirer might be a Ravenclaw or perhaps even someone from Beauxbaton. George nudged Fred, but neither of them smiled. They could see the tension in Harry's shoulders and the helpless embarrassment on his face. Even Ron, who normally joined in light teasing, muttered under his breath that they had probably gone too far. Hermione's glare alone could have brought any magical creature to heel. Later that night, when the noise had finally died down, Harry lay awake in his four-poster bed, listening to the quiet breathing of his roommates. His thoughts churned with humiliation. He had faced dragons and dementors, but the feeling of being mocked, of being the only one unaware of a joke that involved his name and reputation, struck a raw nerve. He remembered a passage in the book Quidditch Through the Ages that said, "Fame is a fickle friend." As he lay there, he felt the truth of those words more sharply than ever. Fame did not simply elevate, it exposed, and sometimes it exposed the wrong parts. Number 17. Truth Serum Incident with Professor Flitwick. Rumours about Fred and George Weasley travelled through Hogwarts the way sparks travel through a dry broomstick, fast, bright, and impossible to ignore. Even those who admired the twins admitted that some of their inventions bordered on reckless genius. Their fifth year was especially turbulent, as their ambitions with Weasley's Wizard Wheezes grew bolder and more unpredictable. One particular incident from that year, whispered about in staff rooms and revisited with mixed chuckles and sighs by graduates, marked the moment when one of their jokes crossed an invisible line. It began with a simple frustration many students shared. Professor Cuthbert Binns, the ghost who taught history of magic with all the enthusiasm of a drifting cloud. Students often joked that one could learn more about the goblin rebellions by listening to the castle walls groan at night. So when Fred allegedly said, if only he'd say something interesting for once, no one thought it would escalate into anything serious. George, ever the partner in chaos, reportedly added that nothing short of Veritaserum could wake their translucent lecturer from his monotone trance. The two began discussing, in whispers that were not nearly as quiet as they believed, the humorous potential of slipping a truth potion into the ghostly professor, Lectern. After all, as Lee Jordan later recalled, the idea of Binns suddenly breaking character and confessing ancient heartbreaks was the funniest thing we could imagine. But Veritaserum, even diluted, was not a potion to be trifled with. The twins had brewed their own version, an experimental blend they proudly referred to as Truth tincture. It was a watered-down derivative they had tinkered with for weeks, claiming it induced chatty honesty rather than unquestionable confessions. The problem was that neither twin had bothered to test how potions interacted with ghosts. Hogwarts ghosts were immune to physical substances, enchanted fluids included. Nearly headless Nick once remarked, "You can pour a bucket of anything straight through us and we feel more than a chill." But Fred and George, caught up in the comedic promise of the prank, skipped their research entirely. In the early hours before class, the twins slipped into the history of magic corridor, their steps echoing softly against the stone floor. Fred carried the small bottle of truth tincture, its silvery shimmer visible even in the dim light of floating candles. Their plan, if it could be called that, was to drizzle the potion across the rim of bins as ghostly lectern in the hope that some mystical interaction might occur. Of course, the potion slipped straight through the wood, dripped off the bottom, and shattered on the floor. Startled by the sudden failure, the twins scrambled to clean the spill, scooping what little remained into a replacement bottle they happened to have with them. They ran off before Filch appeared, believing the episode a harmless misfire. They did not realize that in their rush, they had left the rescued vial on a small shelf near the charms classroom door. It would have been forgotten entirely if Professor Phileas Flitwick had not arrived earlier than usual that morning, balancing an overfilled armful of parchment essays while reaching instinctively for his morning tea. "I distinctly remember a faint shimmer in the cup I picked up," he later confessed to a colleague, "but I assumed I was merely overtired." The vial had tipped into his mug when he set the stack of essays down, its contents dissolving instantly. Flitwick drank the entire mixture without a second thought. When the charms lesson began, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Flitwick perched on his stool, hair slightly tousled as always, spectacles gleaming with enthusiasm. He introduced the day's topic, advanced summoning, and in the beginning spoke with his usual clarity. But then his tone shifted. Instead of focusing on wand movement or incantation rhythm, he began discussing why the charm was personally meaningful to him. "Summoning," he announced, "has always reminded me of how much easier it is to call objects than emotions." The classroom fell silent. Students leaned forward, unsure if this was a metaphor or the start of an unusual lecture. Hermione Granger raised her hand, planning to ask a clarifying question, but Flitwick continued without noticing. He began to speak about a colleague he admired deeply, someone he described with striking tenderness. The small professor, usually composed and precise, confessed that for years he had harbored what he called a quiet, unspoken fondness for Professor Septima Vector of the arithmancy department. "She has a way of furrowing her brow when she concentrates," he said, his voice airy and dreamlike. "It's the sort of expression that makes one want to protect her from everything, even numbers themselves." The class gasped. Harry Potter exchanged wide-eyed glances with Ron and Hermione, unsure whether to laugh or remain mortified on Flitwick's behalf. The confession might have ended there, a touching but mildly embarrassing slip. But truth tincture was designed to unravel layers of internal restraint, and so Flitwick continued speaking with increasing vulnerability. He admitted that he was terrified of mice, a fear so deep it had once made him cancel a scheduled visit to the Muggle Studies classroom because he'd overheard a student mentioned they kept a pet rodent in their pocket. He even described waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares involving swarms of squeaking shadows. "I know it is irrational," he said, "but fears often are." Number 18, Gnome Snot Chews and Public Embarrassment. Fred and George Weasley built their reputation long before Weasley's, Wizard Wheezes, ever opened its doors. Even at Hogwarts, their inventions walked the fine line between brilliance and catastrophe. Among their earliest experiments was a sweet that almost no one remembers today, overshadowed by their later triumphs like skiving snack boxes and portable swamps. Yet this incident stands as a strangely perfect example of how a seemingly harmless prank could ripple through an entire school. The candy was called Chewy Gnome Snot, and for the unfortunate Hufflepuff student who sampled it, the memory would linger far longer than its flavor. Chewy Gnome Snot began as an offshoot of Fred. His fascination with what he once called the comedic potential of disgust. Ron would later recall that Fred had found a jar of pickled gnome whiskers in the burrow, his pantry, and wondered aloud what sort of reaction gnome-based sweets might provoke. George improved the idea by mixing in powdered puffball fungus and a dab of doxy venom for acoustic enhancement. The result was a small, unassuming green lump. When eaten, it produced a steady stream of slimy nasal discharge and, far more horrifyingly, a sharp squeal every time the victim inhaled. The twins claimed the sound fell somewhere between a kettle whistle and a distressed pixie. The boy who unexpectedly became the test subject was Edgar Whittleseed, a soft-spoken fourth-year Hufflepuff known for his habit of sitting in the library, his quietest corner. Edgar had been chosen to give a short address at the school assembly, a rather prestigious moment for a student who rarely stepped into the spotlight. Professor Sprout reportedly described him as nervous but hopeful, and many of his housemates had gathered to support him. Unfortunately for Edgar, Fred and George saw the event not as a milestone for their shy classmate, but as a golden opportunity to test their latest creation. The twins slipped their newest sweet into a small dish of mint humbugs on the Hufflepuff table during breakfast. Edgar, trying to calm his nerves, reached for what he believed was a mint. A prefect sitting near him later insisted that he chewed it thoughtfully for a moment, unaware that the gears of mayhem were already turning. By the time assembly began, the first symptoms emerged. Edgar felt a tickle in his nose, but dismissed it as nerves. Then came the unmistakable warmth of something unpleasant dripping out onto his robes. As Edgar stepped onto the platform, the great hall grew silent. Students leaned forward, expecting a typical speech about unity or kindness. Instead, they heard the strange, high-pitched squeak that escaped from Edgar, nose the moment he took a deep breath. The sound echoed off the enchanted ceiling. Someone from the Slytherin tables snorted. The Ravenclaws exchanged puzzled looks. A Gryffindor first year dropped her quill. Edgar froze in terror. Another breath brought another squeak, louder this time, a sound that resembled the shriek of a malfunctioning charm. Green slime continued to escape from his nostrils, thick as boiling pudding. The professors, unprepared for this spectacle, reacted with a mixture of horror and confusion. Even Professor McGonagall, who usually maintained precise composure, blinked 3 times in rapid succession. Professor Flitwick nearly toppled off his stack of cushions. Hagrid attempted to help by handing Edgar an enormous handkerchief, but the poor boy fled the platform before the half-giant reached him. Some older students insisted the sound of Edgar's squeaking breaths followed him all the way up the marble staircase like the cry of a tormented Cornish pixie. For the next 3 days, Edgar barricaded himself in the Hufflepuff dormitory, refusing to show his face. His housemates tried to reassure him, to bring him notes from classes, even to charm the lingering slime out of his pillowcases, but the humiliation weighed heavily on him. One student claimed that each time Edgar sneezed, the dormitory curtains trembled. One could hardly blame him. Few students at Hogwarts ever suffered a prank so intense that it effectively robbed them of their voice in front of the entire school. The Weasley twins, meanwhile, maintained the same airy nonchalance that marked so many of their pranks. They were summoned to Professor McGonagall's office, where she delivered a scathing reprimand. This was not their first nor their second warning, and yet they somehow avoided harsher consequences. Their punishment amounted to a stern lecture and the confiscation of the remaining chewy gnome snot prototypes. George later bragged that he snuck half of them out before she even noticed. Fred admitted privately that the artsy squeak factor was stronger than anticipated, though he insisted that the experiment was a success. The most striking part of this episode is how it captures a recurring pattern in the Weasley twins' early inventing years. They believed sincerely in the joy of laughter, but they rarely considered the emotional cost to their targets. What they saw as clever mischief often faltered on the edge of cruelty. Even in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, when they bewitched snowballs to bounce off Professor Quirrell's turban, the narration observes that their mischief was relentless and imaginative, yet imagination without restraint is precisely what created moments like Edgar Whittleseed, a disaster. One cannot forget that the twins possessed genuine talent. As Harry once observed, they were the only ones who could make even the darkest day feel a bit lighter. Their charm extended far beyond their pranks, and students admired them for their courage, generosity, and creativity. Their later contributions during Umbridge's regime proved that their rebellious nature could be an instrument of hope. Still, brilliance does not excuse the collateral damage of their early experiments. Chewy gnome snot became one of those stories whispered in corridors long after the slime dried. The lingering memory of the incident also illustrates how Hogwarts operated as a place where magical mishaps could unfold spectacularly. A Muggle school prank might involve itching powder or rubber snakes. At Hogwarts, however, a single sweet could produce an echoing squeal that disrupted an entire assembly. Magic amplified every gesture, every mistake, every unintended consequence. Edgar's humiliation became a school-wide spectacle, not because the twins were malicious, but because magic gave even childish ideas the power to overwhelm. One of the strangest details students remembered was how the enchanted ceiling reacted. During Edgar's squeaking breaths, the swirling sky above reportedly flickered in sympathy, creating ripples of pale green light. A particularly attentive Gryffindor later wrote in her journal that it looked as though the castle itself were wincing. The Great Hall, enchanted to respond subtly to the emotional state of its occupants, mirrored the confusion and shock of the moment. In revisiting the incident, one must also consider Dumbledore's reaction. Though he did not intervene immediately, he was said to have spent a long time afterward standing beneath the enchanted sky, stroking his beard with a thoughtful look. Dumbledore believed firmly in second chances and often allowed students room to make their own mistakes. Yet he also understood the delicate balance between humour and harm. As he once famously remarked, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." That wisdom applied as much to Fred and George as to any aspiring hero. Years later, long after Hogwarts, the twins would refine their values along with their craft. As their shop flourished, they focused more on voluntary participation, directing their inventions toward customers who delighted in chaos rather than unsuspecting classmates. In retrospect, the chewy gnome snot incident became a quiet turning point. Though the twins never apologized publicly, George admitted in a later interview with a wizarding publication that some early experiments taught us what not to do, especially when people didn't sign up for the fun. Edgar Whittleseed eventually recovered from the embarrassment. By his 6th year, he became known for his work in herbology and even earned praise from Professor Sprout for developing a charm that enhanced the growth of flutterby bushes. Still, whispers followed him, and sometimes first years would look up in surprise upon learning that the tall, confident Hufflepuff prefect had once been the boy who squeaked in front of the entire school. To his credit, Edgar never expressed bitterness. When asked about the incident years later, he simply stated that Hogwarts was never boring, a phrase that captured both the blessing and the curse of studying alongside the Weasley twins. In the grand mosaic of Hogwarts history, this episode sits somewhere between comedy and cruelty. It exemplifies the unpredictable journey of young inventors discovering the boundaries of magic and the responsibilities that accompany it. Chewy Gnome. Snot never appeared in the twins' later product line. Perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps they learned that some jokes work better in the imagination than in reality. But the memory remains, a vivid echo, a squeak that once bounced off enchanted stone and reminded everyone that even laughter can go too far. Number 19. Turning Ernie Macmillan into a partial walrus. Fred and George Weasley were known for many things at Hogwarts, but above all for their fearless desire to push the boundaries of magic until those boundaries bent, cracked, or temporarily exploded in a puff of shimmering purple smoke. Their pranks were legendary, charming to some, infuriating to others, and forever unpredictable. But beneath the warm chaos of their mischief lay a truth rarely spoken aloud. Once in a while, the twins crossed a line so fine that even they did not notice it until someone else was already paying the price. The incident with Ernie Macmillan became such a story, one of those whispered episodes that teachers referenced with a slow shake of the head whenever the topic of transfiguration misuse arose. It all began on an ordinary morning in the Great Hall, the kind of morning that smelled faintly of oat porridge and wet cloaks drying by the entrance. Ernie Macmillan, the Hufflepuff prefect, with an unyielding sense of dignity, marched in, carrying his books pressed tightly to his chest. He had always conducted himself with formality, believing that a certain level of decorum separated the responsible from the unruly. On this particular morning, he felt that same calm sense of purpose, until he noticed that the room, his usual chatter, had slowed into curious murmurs directed suspiciously toward him. The first odd sensation came in the form of tightness around his upper lip, a heaviness he could not explain. His friends stared, wide-eyed, but said nothing, unsure whether they should alert him or let him figure it out on his own. When he reached for a biscuit and caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished silver of the serving tray, the world around him paused. Instead of his familiar face, he saw a set of short, rounded tusks protruding just enough to be noticeable, a pair of bristly whiskers, and a bulbous, walrus-like nose that dwarfed everything else on his face. That one glance erased every confident step he had taken into the hall. The Weasley twins, seated several tables away, were watching with the keen interest of scientists waiting for the results of an experiment. Their eyes shone with triumph, but their smirks faded when they realized how silent Ernie had become. He touched his face not with amusement, not even with confusion, but with a stunned, rising horror that spread visibly through his gaze. For a moment the great hall was frozen in place, until, inevitably, the first burst of laughter erupted from somewhere near the Ravenclaw table, ricocheting across the room like a spell gone wild. What happened next was something Hogwarts students would recount for months. Once the laughter began, it grew impossible to contain. Even some of the teachers failed to hide their smiles, though they lowered their heads as quickly as possible to avoid encouraging the chaos. The story later circulated that Peeves nearly fell out of mid-air from laughing too hard. Students nudged one another, whispering, pointing, and gasping for breath as Ernie stood there, red-faced and rigid, wishing desperately for the stone floor to open and swallow him whole. Ernie Macmillan had always taken pride in upholding what he believed to be the noble reputation of his house. Hufflepuffs valued fair play, kindness, and a certain steadiness of spirit. Yet at this moment, with his features distorted into a grotesque mimicry of a walrus, he felt nothing but exposed. His humiliation deepened when he remembered something Professor McGonagall once said during Transfiguration class. Magic reflects intention, but it magnifies carelessness. He understood then that this was no simple accident. Someone had chosen him, not for laughter shared among friends, but for spectacle. Fred and George claimed later that the transformation had started as a harmless joke, an experiment using what they proudly called temporary morphing charms, a type of magic far safer than Polyjuice Potion and 10 times more entertaining. They had intended the changes to fade within minutes, leaving nothing more than a funny story. But the twins, brilliant though they were, had not quite mastered the stability of the spell. Transfiguration had rules, strict and ancient, and the charm clung to Ernie far more stubbornly than they anticipated. When Ernie finally fled the Great Hall, he did so with the stiff-backed posture of someone trying not to run. Behind him, the laughter gradually died down, leaving an uneasy hush in its wake. Hannah Abbott was the first to stand up and follow him, worried about the trembling she had seen in his hands. Others described the moment as the instant the mood shifted from hilarity to something almost shameful. Not because the twins intended cruelty, but because the result had clearly wounded someone who prided himself on control. It took Madame Pomfrey nearly 2 hours to reverse the effects, muttering with tight lips about students, fiddling with magic that ought to be locked away until Newty-level study. While she worked, Ernie sat quietly on the hospital bed, avoiding all mirrors, clutching the blanket with white knuckles. When he finally regained his normal appearance, he did not thank her. He did not speak at all. He simply walked out of the hospital wing with a kind of solemnity that unsettled everyone who saw him that day. For the next week, Ernie refused to speak to anyone, not to his roommates, not to his professors, not even to Cedric Diggory, whom he respected more than any other student. He attended classes, completed assignments, and participated in house activities, but his silence lingered like an invisible wall between him and the rest of Hogwarts. It was said that even the fat friar attempted to console him, but Ernie merely offered a polite nod before hurrying down the corridor. His pride, usually his anchor, had become a weight he could not lift. The Weasley twins, for their part, felt a creeping discomfort settle over them as the days passed. They tried leaving humorous notes on Ernie's desk, delivering chocolate frogs, and even slipping a card signed "Official Apology" from the Department of Experimental Mischief. But Ernie ignored every gesture. Students began murmuring that this time the twins had gone too far. Even Ron Weasley admitted privately that the prank didn't land the way it was supposed to, an uncharacteristic admission that signaled how grave the situation had become. Word eventually reached Professor Dumbledore, who summoned the twins for what many expected would be a stern lecture. Instead, he offered a remark that became famous long after the incident faded. Magic must never become a farce, not even in the hands of those who wield it with laughter. The line echoed something from the books themselves, the wise sentiment Harry once heard, "It is our choices that show what we truly are." The meaning was unmistakable. Humor did not excuse responsibility. Students debated the incident everywhere, from the library to the Quidditch stands. Some argued that Ernie needed a better sense of humor, others insisted that the joke had crossed into mockery. What made the prank particularly memorable was not its creativity, but its unintended cruelty, the way it exposed the vulnerability of someone who was rarely anything but composed. Even those who found the prank funny at first later admitted that the laughter felt hollow once they saw the depth of Ernie's embarrassment. Years later, those who witnessed the event recalled how it altered the atmosphere at Hogwarts. The prank became a quiet lesson about boundaries, reputation, and the unseen weight carried by those who are the butt of a joke they never invited. While Fred and George continued to create some of the most imaginative, magical mischief the school had ever seen, they became more selective afterward, directing their charm work toward volunteers, or those they knew were strong enough to laugh without pain. It was one of the rare moments when the twins, whose laughter felt endless, briefly paused to consider the consequences of the magic they adored. Ernie Macmillan eventually forgave them, though he never forgot the experience. The forgiveness came months later during an evening in the Hufflepuff common room when someone joked about misfired spells. Ernie, in a surprisingly calm tone, remarked that a walrus has its dignity too. The room erupted in laughter, not the mocking kind this time, but warm, relieved laughter that felt like a healing charm cast over an old scar. The Weasley twins later admitted they felt more grateful in that moment than during any of their grandest pranks. In the end, the incident lived on in Hogwarts' memory, not simply as a story about a joke gone wrong, but as a reminder that magic amplifies intent, emotion, and care, or the lack of it. It reflected the delicate truth that the boundary between humor and humiliation is thin, shifting, and easy to cross without meaning to. When Fred and George learned this lesson, they did so not through punishment or reprimand, but through witnessing the impact of their own laughter on someone who valued dignity above all. The story remains one of those small but powerful legends of Hogwarts life, a tale students repeated to each other when experimenting with charms that seemed harmless, a quiet caution wrapped in humor, affection, and a touch of remorse. It captured the heart of what Dumbledore warned, that magic, for all its wonders, demands respect even in play. And perhaps this was why the twins, known for fireworks and chaos, eventually founded a shop that balanced innovation with wisdom, because even mischief in the right hands can learn to be kind. Number 20, the fake Ministry of Magic letter to Percy. Fred and George Weasley had always believed that mischief was a language, one spoken best with fireworks, enchanted sweets, and a level of creativity that would terrify the most seasoned curse-breaker. Their humour rarely carried consequences that lasted longer than a few hours, yet there was one infamous moment in the Weasley family history when even Molly Weasley admitted that the twins had gone a little too far. It happened during the months when Percy Weasley had just secured his long-desired post at the Ministry of Magic. He had grown more rigid, more formal, and far more convinced of his own importance. The shift did not escape anyone at the Burrow, and Fred and George, who viewed pretension as a personal challenge, crafted a prank that would later be whispered among siblings like a cautionary tale about the cost of pride. Percy had always been ambitious, but it was his new job that inflated that ambition to near bursting. He spent dinners lecturing the family about ministry procedures and reminding everyone of proper professional etiquette. He corrected Arthur's terminology, scolded Ginny for passing the salt with her wand, and stared with deep offence whenever a gnome flew through an open window. The twins watched with rising amusement mixed with strategic irritation. They claimed that Percy no longer walked, but glided, always with his nose slightly elevated. Their growing desire to humble him took shape the day Percy received his first official letter on ministry parchment. Fred held the envelope to the light, studying every detail of the seal, the flourish of the calligraphy, and the precise shade of the ink. It became the blueprint for their mischief. Creating the forged letter required a level of craftsmanship rarely associated with two boys who once tried to enchant a toaster to sing Celestina Warbeck. George focused on the handwriting, referencing the neat, ceremonial script Percy admired so much. Fred, who had a sharper sense for authority, replicated the seal using a combination of softened scarlet wax, a button from an old cloak, and an impression spell he had seen Bill use on a cursed document. The final touch, a faint scent of polished oak, came from a cologne Percy himself had purchased during a brief attempt to appear more sophisticated. When the letter was complete, the twins examined it with exaggerated solemnity, certain that even Barty Crouch Sr. would have approved its authenticity. The forged message summoned Percy to a supposed urgent meeting with the Minister of Magic. It referenced matters requiring immediate discretion, a phrase the twins had overheard Percy repeat during dinner more often than the family could tolerate. The note warned that any delay would compromise several confidential operations, a sentence so dramatic Fred insisted it was bordering on self-parody. The letter ended with an elegant signature borrowed from Cornelius Fudge's style, complete with a flourish so grand that Percy would naturally assume the minister had penned it in haste. The twins left the envelope on the kitchen table, placed just slightly askew, as though delivered moments earlier by a hurried owl. Percy treated the letter as a sacred artifact. He read it once, twice, then held it up to the light with the reverence of a man who believed destiny had finally recognized him. His sudden dash from the Burrow interrupted a peaceful family meal. Molly Weasley's roast chicken barely had time to vanish from his plate before he grabbed his cloak and disappeared through the fireplace in a burst of green flames. The rest of the family witnessed the spectacle with a mixture of confusion and concern, especially when Percy muttered about being summoned personally. Fred and George exchanged a silent look of victory as their brother vanished, unaware of the storm that awaited him on the other end of the Floo network. Percy arrived at the ministry breathless and determined, rehearsing in his mind the dignified manner in which he would greet the minister. He imagined himself being entrusted with confidential assignments, perhaps even praised for his reliability. His hopes collapsed the moment he reached the designated office. The door was locked. No lights shone inside. The corridor, usually humming with ministry activity, was eerily quiet in the evening gloom. On the door, secured with a simple sticking charm, hung a scrap of parchment. It read in harsh, blocky handwriting, "You're late, Mr. Genius." The words struck Percy with more force than any spell could have. His pride twisted into rage, his humiliation so profound that it heated his cheeks until they resembled overripe tomatoes. At the Burrow, the evening grew tense the moment Percy returned. He appeared in the kitchen like a thundercloud, his steps crisp and heavy. His expression looked carved from stone. The Weasley twins, who had prepared a list of excuses in case the situation escalated, realized instantly that they had underestimated the magnitude of Percy's fury. Molly met her son's anger with maternal firmness, but even she hesitated when Percy slammed the forged note onto the table, demanding to know if anyone away found this amusing. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing against every wall of the burrow. Ginny stared at her soup. Ron pretended to be fascinated by the pattern on his spoon, and Arthur coughed into his napkin, trying to diffuse the tension. Fred and George retreated to their room without being told. For once, they acknowledged that the situation exceeded their usual mischief. They could hear Percy's voice downstairs, sharp, wounded, full of outrage over being made to look foolish in a place where reputation mattered. He reminded everyone that a Weasley's word reflects on the entire family, echoing an attitude he had adopted ever since joining the ministry. He paced so aggressively the floor creaked under his feet. The twins understood that this was the sort of anger that could not be softened with a simple joke or apology. They sat on their beds in rare, contemplative silence, each replaying the prank and realizing that the line between humor and humiliation was thinner than they had expected. The burrow usually radiated warmth, yet that evening a strange coldness settled over it, one that made even the family clock seem hesitant to move its hands. Percy's pride had absorbed the full impact of the prank, and he carried himself like a man betrayed. In private moments he had spoken often about wanting to make something of himself, not merely as a Weasley, but as Percy Ignatius Weasley, a man of precision, professionalism, and discipline. To fall victim to a childish trick shattered an image he had carefully constructed. The twins, who mocked arrogance as easily as breathing, had unknowingly attacked the foundation of their brother's identity. Molly eventually intervened, her voice rising above the tension like a conductor restoring order to a chaotic orchestra. Yet even she had difficulty calming Percy, whose sense of dignity had been pierced to its core. Within the Weasley family, this incident became a quiet turning point, foreshadowing the growing distance Percy later placed between himself and his relatives. Although this particular prank was not the cause of their eventual rift, it revealed the deep contrast between Percy's earnest ambition and the twins' irreverent approach to life. Fred and George saw rules as suggestions and authority as something to challenge. Percy saw rules as structure and authority as the path to meaning. The forged letter had struck at this contrast with scalpel-like precision. It exposed how seriously Percy took himself and how little patience he had for ridicule. Years later, in retrospect, some members of the family would still tease the twins about the prank, though always with a softened tone. They recalled how George later remarked that they had accidentally achieved a level of psychological precision usually found only in textbooks. Fred, when retelling the story, claimed that Percy, his expression was so intense it nearly set the wallpaper on fire. Despite their bravado, the memory of spending the evening barricaded in their bedroom taught them a cautionary respect for the emotional weight their jokes could carry. The incident marked one of the rare occasions when their mischief produced more discomfort than laughter. The twins' prank also highlighted an essential theme present throughout the wizarding world, the fragility of identity. Percy's strong reaction was not simply about embarrassment. It was about the sudden collapse of how he wished to be perceived: competent, respected, indispensable. When he later stood in the Great Hall during the Tri-Wizard tournament, lecturing Harry about standards and procedures, one could still detect the lingering sensitivity to being mocked. Even Harry once noted in his thoughts that Percy seemed more determined than ever to impress the ministry. The forged letter incident had lodged itself in Percy's memory, shaping his cautious, defensive posture in future moments of scrutiny. Even J.K. Rowling hinted at Percy's delicate relationship with respect through his appearances, such as when he proudly described Mr. Crouch as a brilliant man and admitted he hoped to rise quickly within the ministry. In another moment, Percy declared that it is not a joke matter, referring to official correspondence. The irony of that statement, when contrasted with the twins' prank, became a source of quiet amusement among readers who understood the hidden history behind his words. This interplay between humour and seriousness, between mischief and ambition, enriched the Weasley family dynamic, giving depth to characters often seen only through the lens of comic relief or stern responsibility. In Gryffindor Tower, the incident evolved into a legendary anecdote shared by older students who relished tales of Weasley chaos. Some describe the prank as an example of the twins' unmatched skill in magical forgery. Others interpreted it as a reminder that even the closest families struggled with internal conflicts. It entered Hogwarts' informal folklore alongside stories of Peeves, the poltergeist, and the time Fred dropped a Tung-Tung toffee into Dudley Dursley's hand. Students admired the twins' audacity, yet many sympathized with Percy's humiliation, understanding how vulnerable pride could be in a world filled with unpredictable magic. When the twins eventually opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, the forged letter incident became a private lesson in the ethical dimensions of joke magic. They often joked that the shop would never sell career-ending prank stationery, though the idea of it amused them to no end. Their mischief matured into a craft aimed at laughter rather than harm, and even Percy, years later, learned to appreciate their talent after surviving the darkest era of the wizarding world. The prank that once sparked his fury turned into a faint memory, softened by time, overshadowed by events far more dangerous and consequential. In moments of reflection, some members of the Weasley family later pointed out that the forged letter taught everyone something important. that love within a family can coexist with irritation, frustration, and even misjudgment. Arthur Weasley once remarked that Percy was a boy who wanted to matter, while Fred and George were boys who wanted light to sparkle. These differing desires clashed spectacularly in the prank, but ultimately shaped the family's growth. The forged letter served as a reminder that every relationship, whether familial or magical, carries the risk of misunderstanding, yet also the potential for forgiveness. Even after all the chaos, one detail remained burned in family memory: the note Percy discovered on the office door. Its mocking message, "You're late, Mr. Genius," haunted him for weeks and amused the twins for years. It encapsulated everything the incident represented: ambition meeting irreverence, pride meeting humor, seriousness meeting mischief. In the quiet halls of the Burrow, long after the excitement faded, the family would still recall how that single sentence captured both the brilliance and the recklessness of Fred and George Weasley. And thus the story of the forged ministry letter secured its place not only in Weasley lore, but in the broader narrative of the wizarding world. It stood as an unforgettable example of a moment when Fred and George's humor crossed the delicate border between playful and painful, leaving behind a tale both cautionary and strangely endearing. Number 21, Screaming Enchanted Buttons. The case of the magical buttons began on a windy Thursday morning at Hogwarts, when Fred and George Weasley emerged from their dormitory with the unmistakable gleam of experimental brilliance in their eyes. Their pockets bulged with scraps of parchment, fragments of fizzing Whizbees, and a handful of what they proudly described as semi-stable enchantment anchors. The twins had been brewing a new type of spell they called an attachable charm, a spell that could cling to mundane objects and respond to physical contact. It was the kind of invention that made teachers groan, classmates tremble, and the corridors of Hogwarts ring with sudden bangs and bursts of laughter. For the Weasley twins, this meant they were on the right track. Neville Longbottom wandered unknowingly into their path that morning, tugging nervously at the hem of his too long robe. He was the ideal test subject from the twins' perspective: harmless, distracted, and blessed with a kind heart that made him unlikely to retaliate. Fred nudged George, and the unspoken agreement between them sparked to life like a lit fuse. Neville's robe possessed a neat row of shiny brass buttons, freshly polished after a stern reminder from Professor McGonagall the day prior. These buttons seemed to shine with an irresistible invitation. The twins saw them not as clothing fasteners, but as an opportunity for magical innovation. The enchantment they applied was subtle, almost artistic in its design. Each button received a unique auditory effect, a tiny spell carefully tethered to react whenever the surface was pressed or brushed. The first button produced the snorting grunt of a pig, the kind that echoed loudly and somewhat moistly. The second offered a deep bubbling sound like a cauldron on the verge of boiling over. The third imitated with uncanny accuracy the shriek of a mermaid, reminiscent of those heard during the Triwizard Tournament. And the fourth, which the twins described later as their crowning achievement, detonated with a miniature but alarmingly realistic explosion. None of the buttons were dangerous, but each was disruptive in the way the twins perfected daily. At first, Neville didn't notice anything unusual. His morning was spent scrambling between classes, books slipping from his arms, quills falling out of his pockets, and Trevor the Toad escaping yet again. It was during herbology that he brushed the topmost button while reaching for a pot of bouncing bulb plants. The room erupted with the sound of a heavy pig snorting right beside him. Professor Sprout looked around in confusion, students snickered, and Neville turned bright crimson. He assumed it was simply another unfortunate mishap of his own making, and spent the rest of the lesson trying not to move his hands anywhere near his robe. By lunchtime, the cauldron-like bubbling began. Every accidental touch set off a gurgling sound that made nearby students glance at Neville as if his stomach were performing a musical number. Some joked that he had consumed a particularly rebellious batch of pumpkin juice. Others wondered if the greenhouses had infected him with an experimental plant. Neville tried to fold his arms tightly across his chest to silence the chaos, but this only pressed more buttons and worsened his predicament. He tiptoed into the great hall, hoping that perhaps food would calm his nerves, but even taking a seat activated the mermaid's shriek. The chilling aquatic cry echoed across the tables, startling first years and sending several spoons clattering to the floor. The classroom environment proved even more unforgiving. The enchanted buttons had no respect for academic boundaries, and certainly none for the delicate silence of Professor Flitwick's charms class. When Neville leaned forward to copy a diagram from the blackboard, the explosion button activated with startling force. Students ducked instinctively, and Flitwick toppled backward off his stack of books in shock. For a moment, everyone thought a spell had misfired. Neville's terrified expression made it immediately clear that he was not responsible, at least not intentionally. The twins, seated several rows away, exchanged triumphant glances that spoke of artistic satisfaction. The chaos reached its peak later that afternoon in defense against the dark arts, the class Neville dreaded more than any other. Dolores Umbridge, with her sugary voice and piercing eyes, was presiding over one of her notoriously quiet lessons. She conducted the class with the oppressive precision of a ticking clock. Every cough felt criminal, every rustle of parchment triggered her suspicion. Neville sat frozen, silently praying the buttons would remain dormant. But fate, or perhaps the twins' impeccable crafting, had different plans. Neville shifted slightly in his chair, and the fourth button, which until then had remained strangely silent, activated. Instead of its original explosive sound, something far more sinister erupted from the button. A chillingly accurate imitation of Umbridge's own voice pierced the stillness of the room, screeching, "Silence, Mr. Longbottom!" The sound was so flawless, so infused with her usual venom that several students gasped. Umbridge's face transformed instantly from composed authority to horrified indignation. The idea that her own voice had echoed through the classroom without her consent ignited something dark behind her eyes. The laughter that followed was uncontrollable. Even the most disciplined students struggled to contain themselves, their shoulders shaking as they buried their faces in their textbooks. For a moment, Hogwarts felt alive with rebellious mirth, the kind that thrived whenever Umbridge's control faltered. Neville, however, was swallowed by dread. He felt as though the entire world had flipped upside down, leaving him dangling helplessly above a pit of consequences. The weight of every enchanted button pressed heavily against him. Removing the buttons proved more complicated than anyone expected. The enchantment resisted standard counterspells, and even Professor McGonagall found herself frowning deeply at the stubborn magic. "Tricky craftsmanship," she muttered sternly while examining the robe, though the tight line of her mouth suggested she knew exactly who was responsible. In the end, the buttons could only be removed manually, requiring nearly an hour of careful work to detach each one without setting off the cacophony again. Neville stood stiffly while the teachers worked, feeling as though his entire existence had become a living prank. The event left an undeniable mark on Neville. While he did not blame Fred and George, who later offered him a box of chocolate frogs and a half-mumbled apology, he developed an unexpected aversion to anything involving stitching, seams, or ornate fastenings. He began wearing robes that slipped on without buttons, clasps, or ties, insisting it was simply more practical. His friends noticed how he winced whenever someone mentioned tailoring or mending robes. Even the act of patching a torn sleeve during herbology made his hands tremble. Hogwarts students whispered about the incident long after it passed, embellishing the story with each retelling. Some claimed the mermaid button could summon the giant squid if pressed repeatedly. Others swore the explosion was strong enough to shake the castle foundations. The legend grew, as legends do in magical places, until Neville's robe became a symbol of both humour and sympathy. The Weasley twins proudly regarded it as one of their early masterpieces, often citing it as the inspiration for their later inventions sold at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Books would later describe Neville as a brave and loyal student, noting moments of heroism that defined his journey. Yet even in those accounts, a certain vulnerability lingered. The line, "Neville had never been more embarrassed in his life," resonated strongly with those who remembered the button fiasco, a reminder that courage often begins with surviving humiliation. It was a quiet form of bravery, the kind that shaped him long before he drew the sword of Gryffindor. The peculiar thing about Hogwarts is how every incident, no matter how chaotic, tends to find its place in the tapestry of the castle is history. Neville, as magical buttons, joined that tapestry as a story equal parts comedy and discomfort. Teachers referenced it when discussing the dangers of unauthorized enchantments. Students looked back on it fondly whenever Fred and George launched new experiments. And Neville, with time, learned to laugh at the memory, especially when he watched the twins transform their mischief into a thriving business. The incident also reminded Hogwarts of the fine line between humor and harm. Fred and George, brilliant though they were, occasionally pushed boundaries beyond what some could handle. Their creations often danced between delight and disaster, and it was only through experience, sometimes painful experience, that they learned where the balance should lie. Neville's ordeal became one of those unspoken lessons, shaping the ethical compass that would later guide the twins in crafting products meant for entertainment rather than distress. Years later, when former students reminisced about their time at Hogwarts, the story of Neville's magical buttons surfaced again and again. It stood as a testament to the unpredictable nature of magic, the mischief inherent in youth, and the resilience of a boy who grew stronger with every setback. The enchanted buttons, once a source of embarrassment, evolved into a cherished memory of friendship, transformation, and the peculiar charm of the wizarding world, as most famous school. Number 22, The Stair Trap for Dean Thomas. Fred and George Weasley always possessed a talent for mischief that hovered somewhere between brilliance and disaster, a talent that often left Hogwarts trembling between laughter and catastrophe. Their inventions, pranks, and perfectly timed stunts were usually met with groans, eye rolls, or poorly suppressed amusement. Yet there was one particular afternoon in the Gryffindor common room that would be whispered about weeks after it happened, a moment when their love for chaos crossed the invisible line between harmless fun and unintended torment. On that day, long before the twins opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they decided to test a new enchantment on the staircase that led from the common room to the boys' dormitories, a seemingly simple charm that made every 10th step loop the climber back to the bottom. It was an idea they found brilliant, a small social experiment, a harmless dose of confusion. They had laughed as they tested it on themselves, sprinting up and down without a care in the world, convinced that only a bit of light-hearted chaos would come of it. The twins rarely considered variables such as timing, unlucky victims, or the weight of luggage that might turn a joke into an ordeal. They were not malicious boys, they were simply fearless experimenters. But Hogwarts was full of students who did not share their athleticism, reflexes, or tolerance for magical unpredictability. One of those students was Dean Thomas, a Gryffindor known for his easy smile, passion for West Ham United, and knack for turning even the grimmest situations into a laugh. Dean was rarely rattled by the strange dangers of Hogwarts. He once said, quoting Ron Weasley's frequent complaint, that stairs move, rooms disappear, and portraits argue, and thus nothing in the castle surprised him any more. Yet not even Dean expected that upon returning from the winter holidays with a massive, overstuffed trunk, he would become the accidental test subject of one of the Weasley twins' most troublesome creations. It had been snowing outside, and Dean's gloves were still damp when he reached the foot of the Gryffindor boys' staircase. His trunk was the kind no one should ever drag through Hogwarts, large enough to hold half of Zonko, Kid's joke shop, heavy enough to make a hippogriff groan. Dean had insisted on bringing back art supplies, spare clothes, several textbooks for subjects he did not even take, and a peculiar Muggle board game he wanted to teach Seamus Finnegan. As he gripped the trunk's handle and planted one foot on the first step, he had been unaware that Fred and George, hidden behind the archway near the fireplace, were watching him with the wide-eyed excitement of inventors awaiting their experiment and first true trial. The first few minutes of Dean's climb went as expected. He heaved the trunk up, step after step, muttering to himself, trying to keep his balance as the weight pulled him backward. The twins exchanged silent gestures, thrilled that their enchantment was about to activate. On the 10th step, the charm flickered into life, and in a swirl of magic as subtle as a whispered spell, Dean found himself back at the bottom of the staircase without any memory of missing a step. He blinked, baffled, convinced exhaustion had fooled him. He tightened his grip on the trunk and started again, determined to reach the dormitory before his arms gave out. Dean climbed faster on his second attempt, frustration sharpening his resolve. Sweat formed along his hairline despite the cold draught flowing down from the tower. Yet again, when his foot hit the 10th step, the enchantment triggered. Fred pressed his hand to his mouth to keep from laughing. George leaned forward eagerly, eyes shining. Dean, however, was no longer amused. a sense of déjà vu washed over him. He attempted the climb a third time and then a fourth, each time believing he had simply slipped, miscounted, or been too tired to notice his footing. The magic of the trap was subtle enough that it did not reveal itself, leaving him in a loop of confusion. It was reminiscent of the enchantments Hermione Granger once described while explaining cursed objects, saying that magic can mislead the mind long before the body notices anything wrong. By the 8th attempt, Dean's patience had evaporated entirely. His arms trembled from the effort of hauling the trunk, and he muttered breathlessly that something in the castle must be malfunctioning again. He was the type of student who trusted Hogwarts but did not trust its staircases, famously quoting Harry Potter's remark from their first year that the staircases like to change on Fridays. Dean muttered every complaint he could think of as he pushed his trunk stubbornly up the steps, only to meet the same enchanted reset, each time feeling more tired, more annoyed, and more convinced that the universe was mocking him. Fred and George exchanged glances not of guilt, but of pure comedic delight, marveling at how perfectly their trap was working. A full 20 minutes passed before Dean realized something was terribly wrong. He was not clumsy enough to repeat the same mistake 10 times. He sat at the bottom of the stairs, breathless, staring up at the steps as if they were alive. The trunk sat beside him like an immovable mountain. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, trying to decide whether to risk another attempt or to simply move into the common room and live there forever. He was determined, however, and Gryffindors were known as much for stubbornness as for bravery. He stood again, lifted the trunk once more, and resumed the climb with reckless determination. Fred and George by this point were nearly trembling with held-in laughter, but even they began to sense that the joke was stretching too long. They were not cruel, merely enthusiastic, and they assumed Dean would give up quickly. Instead, he persisted like a knight on an impossible quest. The enchantment, which had seemed hilarious 15 minutes earlier, now appeared somewhat excessive. The twins watched as Dean repeated attempt after attempt, getting weaker, slower, and increasingly bewildered. The humour of the situation had begun dissolving into uneasiness, but neither twin had yet found the courage to cancel the enchantment. They feared revealing themselves, feared McGonagall discovering what they had done, and, more importantly, feared missing the grand finale of their own prank. After nearly 40 minutes of futile climbing, Dean finally dropped to the trunk with a dull thud that echoed through the common room. He stood motionless, staring at the staircase with a defeated expression that could have softened even Peeves' chaotic heart. The few Gryffindors lingering near the fire looked at him curiously, unsure why he appeared as though he had just fought his way through a swamp. Fred and George shared a glance that hinted at the first flicker of guilt. Even they had not expected their enchantment to trap someone in such an exhausting loop. They whispered silently, wondering if they should intervene, but the decision was made for them when Professor McGonagall entered the common room with the fierce stride of a cougar on a mission. McGonagall had been patrolling the corridors after hearing commotion from several floors below. Her sharp eyes fell instantly upon Dean Thomas, red-faced and panting, alongside the trunk that looked ready to explode with belongings. She took in the scene with a single sweeping gaze that only a seasoned professor could deliver, and though she said nothing aloud in that moment, The tension in the room shifted like the tightening of a noose. It was well known among Gryffindors that McGonagall had tremendous respect for Fred and George's intelligence, often quoting Dumbledore's assessment that talent is best used wisely rather than recklessly. But she also possessed the unique ability to freeze a room with nothing but the narrowing of her eyes. Dean attempted once more to lift his trunk, and when the 10th step triggered its loop, McGonagall observed the subtle distortion of the magic. Her eyes flashed with unmistakable understanding. She raised an eyebrow with the precision of a guillotine blade, turned toward the corner where Fred and George were now shrinking into themselves, and fixed them with a stare that could have turned a Hungarian horntail to stone. The twins knew instantly that the prank had reached its natural and catastrophic conclusion. They stepped out from their hiding place, their confidence evaporating like steam from Madame Pince's teapot. McGonagall lifted her wand and dispelled the enchantment with the efficiency of someone undoing a knot tied by an over-eager child. Dean, exhausted but relieved, collapsed onto the nearest armchair. The staircase returned to its ordinary, harmless state. Fred and George stood silently as McGonagall confiscated their wands for 24 hours, a punishment they found surprisingly devastating. To Fred and George, losing their wands was like grounding a dragon, unnatural, humiliating, and entirely too quiet. Rumours of the incident spread quickly throughout Gryffindor Tower. Some students found the story hilarious, others scolded the twins for their lack of foresight. Hermione Granger later remarked that it was a perfect example of why certain enchantments should never be used for entertainment, citing her own exasperation with magical irresponsibility. Ron Weasley claimed that Dean had set a school record for most consecutive failed stair climbs, which made Dean laugh despite his sore muscles. Even Harry Potter, hearing the tale the next day, could not help smiling, though he admitted privately that if it had happened to him, he might have hexed the stairs out of existence. The incident became one more chapter in the legend of Fred and George Weasley, a reminder that creativity without caution can lead to trouble, even when intentions are humorous. Dean eventually forgave the twins, especially after they apologized with a box of skiving snack boxes and a promise to include him in future joke brainstorms. He claimed later that the ordeal had strengthened his resolve, saying that if he could survive an enchanted staircase with £100 trunk, he could survive anything Hogwarts threw at him. For Fred and George, the event served as both a lesson and a source of pride. They never stopped creating, experimenting, or turning everyday moments into spectacles. But they did learn that even the cleverest mischief must account for unintended consequences. Years later, as successful businessmen, they would jokingly describe the staircase trap as the prototype for an unmarketable, ethically questionable, but undeniably effective customer testing device. It remained one of their favorite stories, though they always told it with a touch more humility. The Gryffindor staircase returned to normal after McGonagall's intervention, but the memory of Dean's endless climb lived on in whispers, laughter, and late-night conversations. It was a moment that showcased Hogwarts in all its unpredictable glory, where magic misbehaved, friends lied, professors intervened, and lessons were learned in ways no classroom could ever replicate. In the end, it was not just a prank gone too far, but a snapshot of life at Hogwarts, absurd, enchanting, challenging, and unforgettable. Number 23. Soapy flood in the toilets. The trouble began on a crisp autumn morning when Hogwarts felt unusually quiet. The kind of silence that only meant one thing: the Weasley twins were scheming again. Fred and George had spent weeks perfecting what they proudly called their unclogging powder, a pearly, glitter-like substance that reacted instantly with water, swelling into thick, impossibly dense foam. It was meant, in their words, to be a friendly surprise for unsuspecting bathroom-goers, but anyone familiar with their previous inventions knew that nothing the twins created was ever truly friendly. They had once turned a staircase into a slide that took a full day to reverse, and on another occasion they coated broom handles with a charm that made them spin in circles for hours. Compared to these, the clogging powder looked harmless, until they found a large enough testing site. The miscalculation came not from the invention itself, but from the timing. On that very day, Hogwarts was hosting a special inspection from the Ministry of Magic. Dolores Spinks, a stern-faced witch from the Department of Magical Education, and Bertram Cuff, a senior investigator from the Magical Infrastructure Office, were scheduled to tour the school, corridors, examine its facilities, and evaluate overall safety standards. The castle had been polished to perfection, and even Peeves had been bribed into temporary good behavior, but nothing could prepare the staff for the chaos that would unfold, because two red-haired pranksters simply wanted to brighten the morning. Fred had always believed that humour was at its best when unexpected, and George often said that a little inconvenience built character. That philosophy guided them as they sprinkled a large handful of clogging powder down one of the pipes in the boys' eastern corridor lavatory. They expected a modest eruption, just enough to create a bit of inconvenience and earn a few laughs. But Hogwarts plumbing, with centuries of magical reinforcement, responded with an enthusiasm the twins had not anticipated. The foam surged upward with an almost living determination, filling the pipes faster than they could retreat. The first sign that something was going terribly wrong came when a muffled, bubbling roar echoed through the corridor, followed by a tremor that made several portraits wobble. The long-abandoned portrait of Sir Cadogan's cousin, a once-forgotten knight named Hugh, the over-dramatic, shrieked that the castle is under siege by a white serpent of doom. His cries alerted a handful of passing seventh years who rushed toward the bathroom, only to find it belching thick waves of white foam under the door. The twins exchanged horrified glances, realizing that their product worked far better in large quantities than their small laboratory tests had suggested. Within seconds, the door burst open, unleashing a rolling tide of soap-like mass that surged across the floor, swallowing shoes, ankles, and any attempt to stay clean. The foam produced a bright, fresh scent, something between peppermint and dragon balm, which would have been pleasant had it not been aggressively swallowing the corridor like a living creature. By the time Filch arrived, armed only with a mop and a very bad attitude, the foam had already climbed past his knees. He shouted wordlessly into the chaos, his expression twisted between fury and despair, while Mrs. Norris took one horrified look and fled for higher ground. The disaster reached its peak just as the ministry inspectors turned the corner. Spinks, immaculately dressed in a deep, plum cloak, lifted one eyebrow in disbelief as the foam sloshed toward her. Cuff, a tall wizard with a proud moustache, stepped forward to assess the problem, but was hit full force by a jet of enchanted lather exploding from the second-floor drainpipe. The expression on his face, wide-eyed, stunned and dripping, became the enduring image of the day. He spluttered helplessly while Spinks scribbled furiously onto a clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin, ominous line. Fred and George watched this unfold from behind a suit of armor, realizing instantly that no amount of explanation could soften the outcome. Even for them, this was bad. They had once accidentally turned the entire Charms corridor canary yellow for a week, and they had once filled Snape's classroom with lavender-scented bubbles as part of an experiment gone wrong. But this, flooding a major wing of Hogwarts during an official inspection, made their stomachs sink. George would later admit that this was the single moment he questioned their career path, even if only briefly. The eastern corridor, which normally echoed with chatter and rushing footsteps, transformed into an uncanny winter landscape of white hills and drifting peaks. Several suits of armor groaned under the pressure of accumulated foam, and more than one tapestry sagged heavily, its scenes barely visible under layers of soapy white. Even the usually serene window ledges were coated, giving the impression that the castle had erupted into spontaneous snowfall. Peeves, who discovered the scene minutes later, almost dissolved from joy. He swooped above the mess, tossing bits of foam onto students and chanting, "White whirlwinds of Weasley!" His laughter rang so loudly that a nearby window cracked under the vibrations. Far above the confusion, portraits were complaining loudly about the indignity of being splattered. The fat lady declared that this is worse than the time Peeves used enchanted glue, while the portrait of the medieval healer, Agatha Murlock, fussed that she could not see her own hands through the mess. Her anxiety grew so great that she fainted dramatically, falling into the frame of her neighbouring portrait, which caused an argument that lasted 3 days. The magical aftermath of the foam created chaos even in spaces untouched by its physical presence. Professor McGonagall was the first staff member to arrive, her robes sweeping behind her as she forced her way through the foam. Her expression, famously stern, darkened further when she spotted the inspectors standing like bewildered snowmen. She muttered under her breath, a rare sight, and with a swift wave of her wand attempted to disperse the foam. But the clogging powder was resistant to ordinary cleaning charms, and instead of evaporating, the foam multiplied briefly, rising another foot before stabilizing. Even McGonagall looked caught off guard, a moment that later became whispered legend among the students. To her credit, McGonagall did not immediately search for the culprits. She first ensured the safety of nearby students, then ushered the drenched inspectors toward the Great Hall, where warm fires and dry cloaks waited. But her eyes, sharp and unyielding, kept flashing toward the chaos as if instinctively narrowing onto the source of trouble. And indeed, the twins felt her gaze, even from their distant hiding spot, where they crouched so low that even the armor seemed to pity them. Dumbledore arrived not long after, his robes gliding lightly above the foam, as though the mess parted out of respect or bewilderment. It was one of the few instances when he appeared genuinely, if subtly, irritated. His usual twinkle was gone, replaced by a quiet weight in his voice as he surveyed the corridor. Many later recalled him whispering something reminiscent of his famous line from the Goblet of Fire. Curiosity is not a sin, but we should exercise caution with our curiosity. If the twins had heard it, they might have taken it as a gentle rebuke specifically crafted for them. Though disappointed, Dumbledore acted swiftly. With a graceful, sweeping motion, he drew upon advanced cleansing spells long forgotten by most modern wizards. The foam began dissolving, shrinking into thin ribbons of white that evaporated into harmless mist. It was a testament to his magical prowess that even Fred and George, his invention, yielded. Within minutes, the corridor looked almost normal, though it retained a faint minty scent that lingered for weeks, reminding everyone of the disaster. In the aftermath, the ministry inspectors demanded explanations, though both were still picking bits of foam from their sleeves. Spinks, whose mood had sunk to glacial levels, claimed that the incident demonstrated a severe lapse in administrative oversight. Cuff took a more sympathetic view, noting Hogwarts' age and magical complexity, though he privately admitted that he hoped to never again witness a bathroom erupt like a geyser. The final report carried a mixture of criticism and reluctant admiration, including a note that Hogwarts remains unique in its challenges. Fred and George eventually confessed, though not immediately. Their delay lasted only until McGonagall's voice echoed through the corridors, summoning them with a tone that brooked no argument. To their surprise, the consequences were lighter than expected. They lost several weeks' worth of Hogsmeade visits and were required to assist Filch with scrubbing the corridors, a punishment they described as unforgivably medieval. They accepted it with minimal protest, understanding that they had pushed their luck further than usual. Weeks later, students still whispered about the Great Eastern Corridor foam flood, describing it with embellishments that grew grander each time. Some claimed the foam had reached the ceiling. Others insisted that a giant bubble had floated through the Great Hall during lunch, reflecting Dumbledore, face like a miniature planet. Among the staff, the incident became a private reminder that even the most unpredictable magical accidents could be survived, albeit with patience, humour, and excellent spells. And as for Fred and George, the event became a turning point. They learned that even brilliance demanded restraint, a lesson that influenced their future inventions at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Yet their reputation for extraordinary mischief remained untarnished. As Hermione once said in Prisoner of Azkaban, "Honestly, don't you two ever think before you act?" If the foam-filled corridors of Hogwarts were any indicator, thinking had never been their strongest suit, but heart, creativity, and a touch of chaos always were. Number 24, Partially Invisible Candy Prank. The charm of Fred and George Weasley has always lived in the delicate balance between brilliance and danger, and their school years at Hogwarts produced a trail of half-successful experiments, smoky corridors, and teachers' headaches. Their creations often skirted the edge of acceptable mischief, but there was one particular incident that stood out even among their most chaotic feats. It involved Lavender Brown, a packet of experimental sweets called the Invisibles, and a day that began with laughter, yet ended with a frantic visit to the hospital wing. It was one of those moments when their cleverness outpaced their judgment, and even Professor McGonagall would later admit that the twins had crossed a line many had warned them about. Fred first mentioned his idea in the Gryffindor common room, inspired partly by the disillusionment charm and partly by the fainting fancies the twins had recently perfected. He had been rereading a line from Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix that described how moody the spell made Harry feel, as though an egg were being smashed against his head. The description fascinated him. If magic could mimic that sensation without an actual spell, why not recreate the effect through a harmless, temporary consumable? George supported the idea instantly, as he always had. Their inventions, after all, were rarely born from caution, but from curiosity, and curiosity was a force they never attempted to restrain. They worked in secret behind the tapestry on the 7th floor, using whatever materials could safely or dangerously combine with magic. The result was a lemon-sized confection that emitted a faint mist whenever exposed to heat. When tested on a willing first year with a regrettable tendency to seek attention, the effects were mild. The boy's left shoe vanished for 3 minutes, then reappeared unharmed. It was enough to excite the twins, who immediately refined the concoction into a polished batch of sweets they proudly labelled Invisibles, a moment of mystery. They intended to market them through their future shop, but like many prototypes, the sweets were unstable and extremely unpredictable. Lavender Brown became an accidental volunteer when the twins slipped an Invisiball into her bag between divination notes and a pink quill she adored. Lavender had always been an expressive girl, often reacting emotionally to small surprises, which unfortunately made her the worst possible target for such a test. She popped the sweet into her mouth on the way to Professor Flitwick's charms class, thinking it was one of the Honeyduke's raspberry drops she habitually carried. The magic took hold before she even sat down, shimmering around her like faint static. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and then her hands began to fade, as though sketched in pencil and slowly erased. The room erupted in confusion. Lavender dropped her books, watching in horror as her palms flickered like candle flames. Her classmates froze, unsure whether they were witnessing a prank, an enchantment gone wrong, or an attack. Her face turned pale, quite literally, as her cheeks became translucent enough for several students to see the blurred outline of her teeth beneath her skin. She let out a sound that was not quite a scream, but carried the fear of someone who believed, deeply and instantly, that something irreversible had happened to her. Professor Flitwick tried to calm the class, but the situation escalated quickly. Lavender clutched her nearly invisible arms and stumbled toward the desk, convinced she had been cursed. Her tears slid down her face only to disappear mid-cheek, as if the tears themselves had been swallowed by the spell. The sight of her dissolving hands unnerved even Parvati Patil, who usually remained collected when Lavender panicked. It was a chaotic scene, the kind that made even Ravenclaws whisper nervously about old enchantments and forbidden charms. Meanwhile, Fred and George watched from the back row, not with concern but with scientific fascination. They took notes on a crumpled piece of parchment, scribbling observations such as face opacity at 60% and fading duration exceeds expectations. They nudged each other each time Lavender's form pulsed with the strange magic, seemingly unaware or unwilling to admit that their experiment had gone far beyond harmless mischief. Fred whispered to George that the results were better than disillusionment lessons, and although they meant it as a joke, the timing was painfully off. The atmosphere darkened when Lavender looked at her reflection in the classroom window. She saw only a faint silhouette where her features should have been, and terror overwhelmed her. She ran from the classroom, believing she was losing her body piece by piece. Several students later said the moment reminded them of a line from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Harry believed he saw his own arm nearly boneless after Lockhart's disastrous spell. Lavender seemed to fear something equally grotesque awaited her. Her panic echoed through the corridors, drawing passers-by who stared with open mouths as the girl flickered like a candle threatened by a gust of wind. Madame Pomfrey was summoned at once. She hurried Lavender into the hospital wing, examining the magical residue still shimmering across the girl's skin. The matron muttered that she had seen too many of the Weasley boys' creations and had long suspected that their experiments would one day produce a case she could not easily undo. Fortunately, Lavender's condition stabilized within minutes, the fading reverse charging itself and slowly restoring her form. Her hands reappeared first, then her shoulders, and finally her face regained its natural pink hue. But the trauma remained long after the magic dissipated. Rumours spread through Hogwarts faster than parchment catching fire. Some students claimed Lavender had been cursed by Peeves, others believed it was another mishap related to the Triwizard Tournament, his lingering enchantments, and one particularly imaginative Hufflepuff insisted the castle itself was testing students' emotional resilience. The truth emerged only when Hermione Granger, who had been helping Flitwick restore order, found the shiny wrapper of an Invisiball near Lavender's desk. She recognized the telltale Weasley's Wizard Wheezes pattern and marched straight to the twins, demanding an explanation. Hermione later described the incident by recalling a moment from Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, remarking that recklessness, for all its charm, has its consequences. She insisted that their invention lacked safeguards, testing, and ethical consideration. She referenced the time Ron fell victim to the twins, Tung Toffee, and emphasized that this new experiment crossed a deeper line because Lavender had neither volunteered nor understood what she was ingesting. She demanded that Headmaster Dumbledore address the matter before the twins pushed the boundaries of magic even further. Dumbledore, always patient but never naive, listened carefully. He considered Fred and George's ingenuity undeniably extraordinary, a talent he believed would one day change the wizarding world. But he also recognized that creativity without restraint could become destructive. He reminded them calmly yet firmly of the book, his own insight from Harry Potter and The Prisoner of Azkaban, where Dumbledore had once said that it is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. The twins possessed remarkable abilities, but their choices that day reflected a troubling disregard for the fear they caused. The incident marked a rare moment when the twins faced consequences beyond detentions and confiscated sweets. They were required to assist Madame Pomfrey for a week, learning firsthand how magical accidents affected students emotionally as well as physically. The matron made sure they understood each case, from spontaneous boils caused by poorly mixed potions to dizziness brought on by enchanted ink. It was a humbling experience intended to teach them empathy, something their inventive spirits occasionally overshadowed. Lavender eventually returned to class, though the memory lingered. She avoided unfamiliar sweets for months and flinched whenever she saw the twins whispering conspiratorially over parchment. Parvati comforted her often, assuring her that she was not cursed and that the incident would soon fade from gossip. But Lavender admitted to several friends that the sight of her disappearing hands haunted her dreams for weeks. Her vivid nature made the fear sharper, and she felt, for a brief moment, as though she had been trapped between existence and invisibility. Harry, who heard of the event shortly afterward, reflected silently on how easily magic could slip out of control. He remembered the unnerving sensation of losing bones in his arm after Lockhart's inept spell, and how vulnerable he had felt in the hospital wing. Lavender's panic mirrored that same vulnerability. He did not confront the twins, but he watched them with concern, noticing how their laughter softened whenever the topic arose. Even Ron, usually the first to defend his brothers, admitted that they may have gone a bit too far this time. The Invisiballs never returned to the twins' experimental inventory. They eventually poured their energy into other projects, more stable, safer, yet still mischievous. The lesson they learned was etched into their memories, a moment when innovation collided violently with human emotion. Their legacy remained one of brilliance, but brilliance tempered by the understanding that magic, even in the hands of jokesters, carried weight. And so, in the long tapestry of Hogwarts stories, the fading of Lavender Brown became a cautionary tale embroidered with humour, fear, remorse, and a reminder that even the brightest spark can burn when mishandled. Number 25. The Snoring Goose Pillow, Curse. Fred and George Weasley were known throughout Hogwarts as masters of mischief, artists of chaos, and pioneers of practical jokes whose creativity soared far beyond that of ordinary students. Most of their pranks were harmless, often even admirable in their ingenuity. Yet there was one incident during Harry Potter, as fourth year, that stood out as a moment when their inventions overshot the line between harmless fun and unintended harm. It involved a quiet Ravenclaw boy named Sam Turpey, known to almost no one outside his house, and a bewitched pillow that turned nighttime rest into a spectacle no one would forget. Sam Turpey was the sort of student whose presence could be overlooked, even when standing in direct sunlight. Professor Flitwick once described him as a boy with the soul of a library, always drifting silently between stacks, moving with a softness that seemed woven from parchment and dust motes. He excelled academically, but avoided attention with a devotion bordering on artistry. In a school full of bold personalities, Sam existed like a barely heard footnote. That quietness, unfortunately, made him a perfect target for the mischief-hungry Weasley twins. The idea began innocently enough. Fred and George had been testing a new line of joke products connected to sleep enchantments. They had once told Ron that the dream state is the final frontier of comedy, a phrase Harry remembered when recounting the event later. Their experiments ranged from pillows that emitted slow applause when someone rolled over to blankets that briefly changed colour if the sleeper mumbled. In their minds, Sam Turpey seemed as safe a test subject as any. He slept early, deeply and predictably. What could possibly go wrong? The twins' masterpiece, as they gleefully called it at the time, was a charm woven into Sam's feather pillow. When the boy drifted into deep slumber and began to snore, a soft, nearly imperceptible sound, the pillow would suddenly amplify it into a shout. The voice, enchanted to mimic Sam's exact tone, would cry out, "I am a magical goose. I can fly in my sleep." It was absurd, surreal, and to the twins, irresistibly funny. They believed the spectacle would last one night, produce a few laughs, and fade into the harmless annals of Hogwarts humour. The first night, their expectations seemed correct. At around midnight, the Ravenclaw dormitory erupted with startled shrieks and stifled laughter as the shout echoed across the room. Sam jolted awake but had no idea what had happened. His classmates did, however, and the image of the reserved, introverted Ravenclaw unknowingly proclaiming himself a magical goose was more amusing than they could handle. Even the next morning at breakfast, students from different tables were repeating the line, snickering behind goblets of pumpkin juice. The trouble began on the second night. The charm on the pillow, far from fading, seemed to grow more eager. When Sam began snoring only 10 minutes after falling asleep, the pillow thundered the proclamation again. Students in the surrounding dormitories reportedly heard it through the walls. Some older Ravenclaws joked that even the ancient bronze eagle knocker must have paused in confusion. What had been entertaining once became repetitive, then irritating, and finally cruel. The unending mockery became a weight that Sam Turpie could not ignore. Fred and George had not accounted for how sensitive Sam was to ridicule. He was a boy who preferred invisibility, finding comfort in quiet corners where expectations and attention could not reach him. Being thrust into the spotlight as the subject of an ongoing joke shook him deeply. By the end of the week, the Ravenclaw common room had adopted the chant as a greeting whenever he entered. Some students even traced little wings in the air when he passed by. Hermione Granger, always quick to recognize unkindness disguised as humor, remarked that just because something is funny doesn't mean it's harmless, echoing Professor Dumbledore. Famous reminder that words possess both the power to inflict harm and the power to heal. When Sam began avoiding meals and skipping social spaces altogether, Professor Flitwick took notice. The tiny charms master, well loved for his kindness, had always encouraged camaraderie and respect among his house. He heard students laughing in the corridor one evening, repeating the now famous line with theatrical exaggeration. Realizing the subject of the joke was one of his own, he followed the trail of whispers and soon learned the full story. The discovery left him more disappointed than angry, as he later told Minerva McGonagall, cruelty was most painful when it grew from carelessness rather than intent. The twins had never meant to harm Sam, but harm had occurred nonetheless. By the time Professor Flitwick intervened, Sam's sleep had deteriorated badly. He confessed privately that each night he stayed awake in fear that the pillow would betray him again. His classmates, though not malicious, had contributed to a cycle of embarrassment that drained him emotionally. It reached the point where Flitwick arranged for Sam to sleep temporarily in a small, unused study room near the Ravenclaw dormitories, giving the boy a reprieve while the matter was investigated. The professor even administered a light course of calming draughts, explaining gently that rest was essential for the mind and magic alike. The words reminded Sam of something Madame Pomfrey once told Harry: "A sound mind works best in a rested body." When the Weasley twins were finally confronted, they displayed genuine remorse. They had always prided themselves on crossing boundaries, but avoiding true injury. The realization that they had inadvertently pushed a vulnerable student into distress shook them more deeply than any detentions McGonagall had previously assigned. Flitwick spoke to them not with anger but disappointment, which, as Ron once admitted, was infinitely worse. He reminded them that humor carried responsibility and that laughter built at the expense of someone, dignity was never worth the momentary thrill. The twins accepted their punishment, a lengthy period assisting Filch with reorganizing the castle, mismatched, dust-ridden storage rooms, with surprising quietness. The pillow was thoroughly disenchanted, though it resisted stubbornly at first. Flitwick later claimed that the charm's persistence was unusual, speculating that the combination of the twins' unique magical signatures caused the enchantment to anchor itself more firmly than intended. He added that mischief brewed with brilliance is the most unpredictable kind, a phrase that eventually appeared in several articles analyzing the ethics of student magic. The Ravenclaw common room gradually let the matter fade, though the phrase lingered in Hogwarts folklore. Some students continued to repeat it jokingly in later years, unaware of its origins. For Sam Turpie, however, the episode remained a turning point. Instead of withdrawing further, he began to understand with Flitwick, his patient encouragement, that unkindness from others did not define his worth. The quiet boy found solace in studying advanced charm work, eventually developing a spell that muffled environmental noise for improved concentration, a charm that proved so useful the library later adopted it for study rooms. Harry Potter himself became aware of the incident when he overheard Ernie Macmillan recounting the story with exaggerated flair in the Great Hall. Harry remembered too well how ridicule could wound. His first year had taught him that fame came with whispers, and not all were kind. He felt a surge of sympathy for Sam and later reflected privately that Hogwarts, though magical, still struggled with ordinary human failings like teasing, conformity, and the fragile boundaries between humour and harm. The Weasley twins, for their part, carried the lesson with them. Though they continued creating ingenious inventions, they became more mindful of how their pranks affected others. When they later opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, one of their guiding principles was that every joke should make people laugh together, never laugh at someone who cannot defend themselves. George once remarked that the Sam Turpie incident stayed with them, like a squeaky hinge, small but impossible to ignore. Even years after the event, students occasionally recounted the tale as a cautionary whisper. It reminded them that magic, like humour, magnified intention. A charm meant for amusement could transform into something sharp-edged if not handled with empathy. The castle itself seemed to know this truth. As Dumbledore once told Harry, "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Fred and George had ability in abundance, the choice to be wiser, kinder, and more attentive to others. Feelings became their real mark of maturity. Sam Turpie went on to complete his studies with distinction. His name never became famous at Hogwarts, but it did appear occasionally in small academic publications on charm theory. In a quiet way, he embodied another truth of the wizarding world. Strength often grows in silence, not spectacle. His resilience, though rarely discussed, left a stronger imprint on the school than any joke ever could. Thus the enchanted pillow that once declared, "I am a magical goose, I can fly in my sleep," became part of Hogwarts lore, not as a tale of hilarious mischief, but as a reminder of the fragile balance between laughter and kindness, creativity and compassion. And within the echo of that magical shout lingered a lesson every witch and wizard eventually had to learn. Even the lightest joke could cast a long shadow unless guided by empathy.